in the hiccups of life.
Yeah. Just stop it some transcribing. There we go. Right, I'll reshare.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, well, hi guys. So this is the Fish and Turtle webinar for the Southwest Marine Ecosystems. I need to say that what we've pulled together, much of which comes with your help and inputs, as a result of our community of practice meetings. We started this community of practice idea back in December with a lot of the contacts that Doug and Simon had made. We're now up to, I think, over 60 contacts in that community of practice. And if you know of people who would like to join that community of practice, please send me an email. This is a webinar about the observations on fish in 2024. There are two other fish webinars that will be very shortly on the SWME website. One is on forage fish and the Peltic surveys by Jerome van der Koe, and the other is a webinar on fisheries, which was held last week, run by Libby West. Can I have the next slide, please? What you'll see today are inputs from significant inputs from a number of people. I mean, many people have contributed to the COP, but there's a really very long list now. And what we intend to do is to call upon a number of these people who can be here today to talk about the slides that have been prepared, often with their input. So Simon and Douglas will kind of provide the overall host of the session, but we'll call upon a number of people to help with that. Okay. Next slide, Bex, please. We've set some functions of this, fish community of practice, and you can read these, but essentially we're looking at rare fish records. We're looking at range extensions, range declines, species of common, conservation interest, seasonal shifts, and fish events. Okay, and I have to say there is a massive amount going on in the Southwest, and you'll get, a really good flavour of that at the moment. It really is kind of a remarkable time, and thank everyone for contributing to that. These are themes that we'll kind of run through the talk and throughout the day. Can I have the next slide, please, Bex? I think for me, what's been one of the most remarkable things about preparing the report, and we've now got about a 25 page report, which all of the COP members will receive very shortly. But it's basically based on observations from a very wide range of different sources. And for me, what's really one of the most notable and remarkable things is how we're getting corroboration of trends you'll hear about between the different observer types. So, the anglers are basically, supporting what the kind of divers are seeing. The webcams are supporting what, the remote tracking people are seeing. So there's a kind of whole, array of things that are helping us build up a picture. And it's being corroborated by different, sources of information. And I think that's really, really interesting and really quite powerful for what we're doing. Anyway, without further ado, I'll pass you on to Doug. Have the next slide, please, Bex, as well.
Okay. For some time now, I've been saying that we've got significant populations of marine lampreys in the Tamar and apparently in the Exe as well. I don't know anything particular about that, but they do tend to be rather overlooked. Several estuaries around the country are notified for them as significant species, but not in the Tamar. several pairs have been seen building reds up at Gunnis Lake. Rob Hurrell and others have been looking at those, and also on the liner. There seems to be a pattern of once they've gone through the juvenile stage, when they're plankton feeders buried in the mud, they actually then migrate out to sea to start feeding on marine fish. And that seems to happen in this area, that they move down through the Sound in December, January. Get quite a few reports from anglers of catching whiting in that area with young lampreys on, kind of 4-inch type things, 10 centimeters. One remarkable report came in December, this photo from Bill Colston, of a common dolphin off Berry Head with a large adult marine lamprey attached. Now that seems remarkable in itself, but even more remarkable, it's the second time this has occurred. Mike Langman photographed one in January 2021 in Tor Bay, the same thing. So it does look as if lampreys do fairly regularly attach to dolphins. One of the first reports of marine lamprey, when I started collecting these reports, was from some fishermen who were anglers who were out angling, and one attached itself to their transom of their boat. Anyway, it's an interesting group, and be nice to keep track of what's going on with it. So that's me. Over to Simon now with his elasmobranchs.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure how I feel about following lampreys after somebody dropped one down the back of my jumper once, and a uniquely unpleasant experience. But now I actually go on to one of my favourite species, the blue sharks. I'm very lucky that I have a large group of skippers who present data to me every year, and I also get data on blank days, which makes it incredibly useful. This data is actually passed on to ICAT via reports, and it does form part of the ICAT reports on the species. Last year was another good year for blue sharks. There were 2,041 blue sharks from Looe, from just over 400 trips. Murray Collins, for the first time ever, never had a blank day. So he caught sharks every day he went out, and Murray works virtually every day that weather will allow, and some days that weather won't allow. As we can see from the catch per unit effort, it was up above 5. This is just from Looe. It was similar in Plymouth and in Falmouth, but interestingly, not quite the same west of the Lizard. As per normal, we saw 96% of the fish were female, which is about right. Most of them are sub-adults or juveniles, but we do get an increasing number of mature fish. The next one was actually wrong. It was 150 kilo male. Was caught from Dan Marget's boat exactly 1 year to the day after we actually had a similar sized fish from Plymouth, which is remarkable. It does seem that the males turn up on the same set of tides every year, and you will see when they're around, most of the females you catch beforehand, you always seem to catch the males later on in the day, have fresh bite marks on them. As I said, the distribution of angling catches, as per normal, reflected the position of the Ushant and Celtic tidal fronts. So the fish were present from Falmouth to Plymouth and even a little bit east. But strangely, there were fewer west of the Lizard, and it reflected that the Ushant front had returned to a position it was more likely to see 10, 15 years ago. There wasn't sort of a bypass that ran to Penzance. Still quite a lot of fish on Penzance, but nowhere near the numbers they've seen in previous years. Can I have the next slide, please? So we were fortunate enough last year to work with NOAA. The aim was to tag with conventional fly tags over 2,000 blue sharks in the southwest and West Wales, and we managed, I think, 2,041. It's a pretty good effort by the skippers involved. In addition, we attached 6 PSATs and 1 spot tag, or Matt Witt's team at Exeter did. And these are the locations of Tasha the shark after she was caught. And she basically spent about 2.5, 3 months just running the edge of the tidal front, the Ushant tidal front, of northern France and the Bay of Biscay. I haven't got the satellite picture overlay of the chlorophyll, but she spent most of her time in high productivity areas, as you probably expect. At the end of her time, she ran off the shelf, and then the spot tag detached. But yeah, it's pretty much what we see with the blue sharks. They love following the fronts. Next slide, please. Thresher sharks, well, they're really the story of 2024. Since about 2015, thresher sharks have been sighted increasingly from the southwest. I mean, before that, the hotspot for them was the Isle of Wight, especially around the south of the island and to the east of the island. But this year, I've had 24 fish reported to be released across the southwest, and there have also been other sightings from Lyme Bay to North Devon. The largest fish I heard about was a 500-pound fish, which was released from Robin Chapman of Bite Adventures from Penzance, and that's the first thresher he's seen in 40 years. Interestingly, there were 4 released in one day from the Old Wall, which is just off the Carrick Roads in Falmouth. And one of the commercial tuna skippers encountered 4 from the Seven Stones Reef, which is north of the Scillies, from September and November. They were all released, but he also saw several others, including some very large fish. I actually saw one. I started commercial fishing for pollock when I was 16. So in 40 years, I'd never seen one, and I saw one. I actually managed to see one in the Manacles, which was lovely. Jumping out of the water in a shoulder bass, she was sort of side flipping back into them, and then she'd go around with her tail, smashing them, and then pick them off. It was an amazing thing to see. There was another one seen off the Manacles as well by the skipper about a week later, and one of the other people saw them. So they do seem to, they used to be incredibly rare in that area, but it's nice to see that they've actually do follow the shoals back to the west at the end of the season, and there are also several seen off Penzance during December. Have the next slide, please. Unfortunately, there were 3 reported strandings. In November, there was one reported stranded at Clovelly, which was entangled in a net. It was refloated by the RNLI, but unfortunately washed up dead the next day. In December, there was one reported washed up near Watergate Bay. There have been quite a few threshers sighted at that time of year, and they tend to be around the sprat shoals or the herring shoals that are prevalent in Clovelly Bay. Particularly unfortunate was one that was found dead on Par Beach. A post-mortem showed that it did have severe traumatic damage to the soft tissue and cartilage of the upper and lower jaw, with a 5mm diameter hole running through the entire lower lip. I mean, it's been said it's hook damage from recreational fishing. I'm not sure if it's hook damage or damage from a gaff, but whatever the damage is, it shouldn't have happened. Most anglers fish with circle hooks, and circle hooks exclusively catch in the corner of the mouth. Unfortunately, some people seem to be using J hooks, which are associated with very poor survival of thresher. So we're trying to discourage that practice. Have the next slide, please. No, does Harriet want to do the basking sharks, or shall I do them? No, that's fine. I'll do them. Unfortunately, basking sharks in the southwest are becoming increasingly rare. I remember in 2005 they were a common occurrence, especially in the spring and in the autumn months. I remember seeing 4 or 5 in one day in Bigbury Bay, but last year very few seen, only 5 reported. I mean, there have been occasions where it's happened before. There were low sightings from 1987 to 1997, but there is evidence that they've actually moved north, and the sightings are very high off the west coast of Ireland and around the Isle of Man. So hopefully it's a relocation thing rather than a decline in the population. But I must admit, I do miss seeing them because they're quite a sight. Next slide, please. Other elasmobranchs. Well, the blue skate. Dipterus batis. Scott Belbin, who's an East Coast skipper, came down for a busman's holiday and fished out of Falmouth. And he was actually trying for a 6-gill, but during one trip he had 16 blue skate, varying sizes. The one in the picture was one of the biggest. It's from an area that I know quite well. It's an area where you can't trawl, and is commonly fished for pelagic sharks. But it's quite impressive to see these fish actually appearing in numbers. And they have been reported all the way from the Chesil Beach to Lyme Bay. Also, they have been reported off the west coast of the Isle of Wight, and interestingly, they've returned to grounds where skate were fished for in the 1960s, exactly the same areas. So it does seem this species is doing quite well. There was a possible report of a flapper skate, which is the two species were classed together by an angler. Hasn't been confirmed, but I think Doug thought it was a flapper skate. So if so, it shows we have both species present, which is quite unusual. An interesting one, if not particularly rare, they're caught quite often in nets, was Murray Collins on Swallow 2, caught a cuckoo ray. They are rarely caught on rod and line, probably because we just don't fish for them. This fish was returned alive to the water. Next slide, please. Stingray. An angler reported a capture from low bar, which is unusual, to be fair. Stingray are relatively common around the Solent, but they're pretty rare to be seen west of the Solent. I've only ever seen a couple come up in nets. Undulate ray, which have been increasing both in range and number. They seem to be reduced all the way from the area where they're common, which is sort of Sussex, down to Lyme Bay. Anglers are reporting less being caught. It has correlated with the relaxation of commercial catch restrictions. Whether that's actually the cause is unknown. Spur dog, we do have large quantities of spur dog. We have especially large females, which are seen off Start Point quite commonly, some ridiculously large. These fish will be in excess of 50 years old. There was less of them caught last year, the big females, but there did seem to be more around the Penzance area, and there was some exceptionally large fish caught. Small picture of a spur dog doing their thing. The males are still very common. You come across males in a lot of places, but they seem to occur. They're quite patchy distribution, so you'll get them from Start Point to just west of Plymouth, but they're relatively rare out of Looe. Don't see them much out of Falmouth, but again, they're relatively common out of Penzance, and then around the north coast all the way into the Severn Estuary. Next slide, please. Mackerel. Mackerel have, throughout my lifetime, mackerel have the habit of changing their where they are and when they are, but this change, I've never seen mackerel not appear off the south coast of the UK in the summer. And this year you were very lucky if you found enough for bait, but they turned up late in the season, September, October and November. If you're shark fishing during the summer, you can't really rely on getting these fish for bait anymore. We now have to buy sardines for chum, and we quite often use whiting for bait. But the traditional Gurdy fishery that used to happen in Whitsands Bay all the way west to the Penzance has declined. There aren't a lot of people doing it anymore just because the fish aren't there in sufficient numbers. Give you some idea, in 2015, 2016, there was a really thriving small boat fishery for mackerel. But there's now, for the first time, I think it's now declined a bit, but there is a fishery for mackerel off Greenland. They're also found off Iceland and in large numbers off Norway. So this actually might represent a range shift. But we do see mackerel now all winter in the Tamar, together with garfish, which is another species that have declined during the summer. We would probably normally see 100 garfish in a slick when we were shark fishing. I think I saw one last summer. So it's another interesting species that seems to have changed its time of year and the range of that it actually is around here. Next slide, please. Tom Horton was going to do this, but I'm quite happy to do it. Bluefin tuna, the bane of my life. I've been unfortunate enough to catch a few, and I never want to see another one. They contributed to my heart condition, so I have a personal grudge against tuna. UK was allocated by a quota of just over 66 tonnes. 39 tonnes was given to a trial commercial fishery, and the recreational permitting scheme, 16 tonnes were given to, I believe, 80 boats. They had to report the catches, but there wasn't a lot of tagging going on. But for more details, see the DEFRA website. Amazingly, there was more than 4,000 bluefin tuna caught in the catch and release fishery. I believe Tom and David Wrighton actually released their tagging study, and certainly there were studies released to ICAT as well, which I had my name on for. I was involved with it some years ago. There are an awful lot of bluefin tuna around from about July last year until after Christmas. It was very rarely you didn't go a day without seeing one if you were out in a boat. They are around the bass shoals, they're around the pollock shoals, they're around the shoals of bait fish, and normally you would see them actually attacking quite small prey. It seems to be easier for them, and sometimes they're almost doing a basking shark impression. They were just going through fry with their mouths open and sort of just scooping them up and going off somewhere else. I mean, that's an amazing picture of one of a BFT actually chasing a garfish. They love garfish, and if you've been lucky enough, you work at the NBA, it's very possible you've actually seen one jumping and just off Drake's Island, especially during November and December when the garfish are there. They'll come right in close. There've even been reports of them up the Tamar. So yeah, they are a species that if you told me 10 years ago I'd be seeing that many, I would have laughed, but they're now something that you see virtually every time you're out. And thanks to Rupert Kirkwood for that amazing picture. Next slide, please. Right, Peltic, that's definitely not mine. I don't know who's going to do this one, but please talk to it. Am I doing this? I'm quite happy.
No, it's all right. I'll do it.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
I'll do it. Okay. Okay. So I should say that for those of you lucky enough a couple of weeks ago to sit in on Jerome's webinar, which will be posted on SWME YouTube channel fairly shortly, it was mind-boggling. You'll know if you know his work that this has been an amazing success story in terms of systematic surveying of the forage fish populations, and just running through some of the kind of main headlines, which I hope that I've summarised kind of correctly. He works, on recording sardines, sprats, and anchovies, and in this systematic survey up the channel and also into the Celtic Sea. I think one gets the sense that they're all doing quite well, all these species, but there are absolutely colossal changes in the biomass of the species between years, which I think are kind of, he hasn't seen it. He didn't give us any picture of why those changes were happening, but they are absolutely massive. Down one year, up the next year, and we're seeing them being preyed upon by a whole variety of other things. There are big changes to the understanding of the stocks and ecology of that, particularly of anchovy, in terms of the way anchovy stocks seem to be developing. He's also doing systematic sightings of a whole variety of other things, including bluefin tuna, but also rarer pelagic species. For any of you who want to read more about this, all the Peltic survey reports are published on the CFAS website. And as we said, there's a webinar on this, which you'll see on the YouTube channel. What was very interesting for me was that over the last 2 years, and I know this is about birds, but there have been some astonishing numbers of cories and great shearwaters seen off places like Gwenep Head, and Jerome was able to confirm absolutely massive changes, increases in the number of these two species of shearwater from the survey work they've been doing. These are birds that were great shearwaters, extraordinarily rare, 1 or 2 sightings a year, 7,000 sightings off Gwenep Head in 2023 and seeing offshore. So there are some interesting things going on our coast. Next slide, please, Bex. I think we're back to Doug.
Yeah, very briefly from me. As well as the bluefin, we do get some small tunas turning up in Britain. Commonest is the bonito. Not so many reports of those in 2024, but there was a small fishery for them off the North Devon coast. They were catching quite large adults. Some years we get mainly juveniles, other years adults. We also get albacore tuna turning up from time to time. Very rarely do we get yellowfin. It's about 4 reports and about 7 reports of big eye tuna. But surprisingly, the skipjack, which is one of the commonest tunas worldwide, has only been about 5 reports. And this fairly large one at 9 kilos was found stranded in Helford Creek. So that is one of the tunas that doesn't often come into our waters, but did do last year. I think I hand back now to Bex. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is over to Matt. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so we had a really interesting occurrence last year, something that hasn't been seen before in such a large number. We had strandings of dead sardines all around the Cornish coast, particularly large numbers off Newquay, but they're also seen off the Lizard, in Mounts Bay, and all the way up as far as Looe, and up as far as Bude. So yeah, it was quite unusual, and we didn't ever really get to the bottom of why it had happened. We had reports from the sardine fishers in Mounts Bay saying that they had seen fish on the surface gasping and dying and floating on the surface. So the fishers were concerned as well. Samples got taken away for analysis by CFAS, but we didn't ever get any reports back on any findings from those samples. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to them, but perhaps they were unable to find any cause of death from the samples we supplied. It was over. It lasted a few weeks, didn't it, Bex? And then it was over. So I think it went on for about 3 weeks. I'd have to check the records. But yeah, not witnessed before as far as we know.
And as you can see from that map, it was mostly concentrated in a few days as well, sort of the middle of March there, and it corresponded with a spike in common dolphin strandings in March too, which I don't know related.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
Move on.
Yep.
Well, I see Steve Colker's with us, so can he comment on these next couple of slides?
Yep. Absolutely.
Very happy to.
Yeah.
Very happy to. Hello, everyone. Yes, because you're looking at what's happened in the last year, this isn't really about that. This is more about bringing to your attention something that is slowly happening. We are seeing a restoration of sturgeon to UK waters. The history of this very quickly is that many would think it's an occasional vagrant. I've now developed a database personally over the last 20 years of 5,300 records since the 15th century, with a lot in our rivers, a lot around our coasts. By 2020, we formed something called the UK Sturgeon Alliance, which is ZSL, Blue Marine, my institute, Fisheries Management, and some other bodies. And we're now in the process of working very closely with French and German and Baltic colleagues, because they're all doing restoration. And it would appear that these are pan-European stocks that spawn in some rivers, not all rivers, and they can travel very long distances. And in the modern era, since 1990, which is roughly when they started to do restoration in the Gironde and then later in the Elbe, and then more recently in the Baltic, we've had these 6 or 7 year old animals turning up in our marine waters. This is a classic one. This is the latest one. This was southeast of Dartmouth, as you can see, in July of last year. That's what we want. We want people to catch them, take a length if at all possible, and carefully put it back in the water. With a photograph like that, I have German experts who can identify that as either Accipensis sturio or its close related species, Oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus is being stocked in the Baltic and Sturio in the Elbe and in the Gironde. They stay in their natal river and estuary for the first 3, 4, 5 years, we think. 6 or 7, they will start to put out to sea. But by putting out to sea, they can do 1,000 kilometers, no problem at all. They are not an oceanic species. They tend to stay close inshore. It's worth saying they only feed in the marine environment. They're feeding specifically on tube-dwelling oligochaetes and small crustacea. Now, when you look at our marine records, you can see where they were being caught in the past. And when you map that against known marine habitats today, it's not surprising. They're looking out particular habitats to feed in as foraging grounds. And since 1990, we've had 34 animals now returning to our waters. 18 of those have come from the southwest, and they are feeding in areas where they used to feed 200 years ago. They're being taken there. Lyme Bay, Start Bay, off Looe, off Plymouth, off Eddystone. So we assume these animals are slowly recovering to some of their former haunts. We've had 2 reports so far from an estuary. These are visual reports of people seeing them in shallow water. And we've had 1 stranding in South Wales in the Dovey, in the mouth of the Dovey. And that's where this collaboration of people is so important, because that one, the Dovey, was spotted by a dolphin stranding group. This is an animal that doesn't seem to worry if the tide drops out. It will stay feeding in muddy waters in the mouths of estuaries. And in the past, it was sometimes reported by commercial fishermen as flapping around in the mud behind them while they're fishing for salmon at low water. So as the number of these animals rise, we're going to see more and more reports from both commercial fishermen, as we see here, but in the future by members of the public. So we're involved in a process of further education, and I was only too happy to get involved in this community of practice to help with that education. So in our page today that we've inserted, you've got both some contact points for the UK Sturgeon Alliance, Save Our Sturgeon, and a map. And the map is our first attempt to put some of this data out into the public domain. Of our 5,300 records, this is the 2,500 of those where we've either got accurate or at least approximate locations of capture. And so we've mapped all that, which is now publicly accessible, and you can see it. But it's worth saying that
Bex, I think that's our next slide.
Oh, right. Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's the part. That's just an excerpt from this historic map, both river and coastal waters. And if you look on that map and pick on one of those circles, you'll find you can drill down to individual captures. You can also drill down within those captures to comments that came from the newspaper report from which most of those reports came from. It's worth saying, if anybody's interested in this sort of thing historically, you've now got superb mechanisms like the British Newspaper Archive, who are trying to archive every newspaper since 1700 when they first started. They're fully searchable. I quickly quadrupled our records in early 2000 by spending 3 or 4 months on that site. And in many cases, although they're newspaper reports and you could argue that they're not necessarily accurate, some of them have 3, 4, 5, 6 different independent reports of the same fish. So you can assume that most of that is fairly accurate. That only goes to 2000 at the moment, that mapping process, only because of our 34 more recent accounts. Some of those records are held by collaborators in Europe, and we haven't yet sorted out how to mix them all together and publish them. Certain scientific papers being generated at the moment on if and when sturgeon actually bred in this country, which we now think they did to some small extent. The main river systems were the Severn, the Wye, the Trent and the Yorkshire Ouse, and in Scotland the Tay and the Forth. In the southwest, we've got 20 reports, historical reports from the Exe, another 14 from the Tor and the Torridge, but none of those fish seem to go too far up the system. And this seems to be a classic part of their ecology, which is very complex. We're still trying to understand it. In the Severn, for example, the biggest system, we've now got multiple reports of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fish moving up in short order over several weeks. Some of them were later dissected and found to be females, so that at least there was an intention to spawn. But so far, we've only found three fish from museums, which are smaller than 50 centimetres. And that's a key thing, because they can't put out into full strength seawater till they get that size. So we probably once did have a modest spawning population, but overall, it was probably a pan-European population, dominated by fish from both the Elbe, the Gironde, and some other systems as well. But we are working very closely with both UK authorities and with German and French colleagues on trying to patch together the history of this culture. And the southwest, and particularly marine waters in the southwest, seem to be a big part of this picture. So I'm only too pleased to have been given the time to mention this today, and to get involved in the community of practice so that we can spread this information further. You can see by the picture on the last shot, that's a classic. Most of our reports have come from that process from commercial fishermen. And it used to be the case, going back to 2000, that somebody would catch one, and the first thing that somebody would know, it would be somebody like Doug Hurton. Thank you, Doug, for all your hard work on this over the years. It'd be somebody like Doug, a reporter from a fishmonger slab. We're now getting to the point where they're being caught, photographed and put back in the water. We're making progress, but we still have a lot to do. So thanks again, Doug. You're much appreciated in all of this. I think that's
at one point, Steve. Yeah. Most of them still think they have to be offered to the king. Is that still the case?
That's a really interesting historical point,
Doug. Or the Duke of Cornwall.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really interesting point. It is very possibly an early example of a conservation measure taken by a head of state. When Edward II did that, I think it was 1345, at exactly the same time it was done across Western Europe in a number of other river systems. And if you go back to the Doomsday period and whatnot, there was an awful lot of comments about why have we got all these fixed traps in all of our rivers. It was raised in the Magna Carta as well. So we had massive river fishing with static nets, which took an awful lot of the large migrants out, and sturgeon were reasonably easy to catch in that sort of circumstance. I now think, looking at the records, that the most of the damage was done as soon as the steam trawler was invented, because they were taking significant numbers of fish from specific areas across northwestern Europe. I probably took out most of the brood stock then. What we have left now is an echo that the French and Germans are trying to rebuild again. But to come back to your point, yes, the royal prerogative says you're supposed to offer it to the crown. In fact, Edward III modified that and said it's only within 3 miles of the coast. But then how do you prove where it came from? And so we've started to work already with the Crown Estate, because they are somewhat, how's the best way to, they're somewhat embarrassed by this. They don't actually want to be offered a dead animal which actually has as many conservation labels as black rhino does. So they would rather work with us somehow to promote this somehow and get the animal put back. But you're right, this is an education process and we have to get to that. Probably the saddest one, which you'll know very well of, Doug, is in 2004, a 120 kilo fish was taken off the South Wales coast.
Yes.
And it ended up on the steps of the Natural History Museum after the fishermen had tried to sell it for caviar, do all sorts of things. And then I'd gone to the royal household who weren't interested. After it was put to the Natural History Museum, they found it, in fact, Oxyrhynchus. And Oxyrhynchus had died out in the Baltic by at least 1990. And here we were in 2004 with one of the last known animals still swimming around the southwest coast of Wales. So recording these animals and putting them back and going forward is absolutely vital.
Okay, we better move on.
Okay.
We better move on.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. Back to you, Simon.
Black bream. Anyone know I was brought up in Sussex, so I remember fishing for black bream from when I was a child. But typically, the black bream was replaced by the black spot bream about west from Star Point. Black spot bream, unfortunately, just disappeared overnight in the early 80s. It was a fish that was incredibly common off the southwest, and it just disappeared with only a very few reported each year. Interestingly, in the last few years, the black bream has returned to, or actually expanded its range to the areas of Plymouth and Looe. I think they've always been around in North Cornwall, and they're certainly around off Land's End late in the year, but we haven't really seen black bream off Plymouth and Looe. And there's some very large fish in there as well. They're in exactly the same areas that the black spot bream used to inhabit, which is very odd, but they're around in fairly large numbers, so people can see up to 50 fish a day from some of these reefs as they fish for them. Fortunately, now a lot of them put back. Most of the skippers have actually imposed some sort of restrictions in certainly west of Lyme Bay, especially the big ones. They encourage to go back. They're often in shoals with the Couch's bream, which are rarer but occur in very large numbers around these areas. The black bream off Plymouth and Looe seem to prefer rock-on-rock areas, so often they're on pinnacles on hard ground, which is quite different from the areas where they're found off Sussex, which tend to be around the chalk reefs, and they're often found on the sand and the chalk rubble around the reefs. Interestingly, these fish now seem to overwinter in the southwest, and one of the skippers reported catching 5 last week, which is round about the season where they spawn. So it'd be very interesting if they do the same thing as they do off Sussex, where they dig out their own nests and the males then guard the eggs. I gather, I think Pete's going to talk about the Fish Intel project and the FISP projects, but I gather that one of the fish that was tagged off Bournemouth or Poole was actually pinged off the Eddystone recently. So it does show these fish will actually spread. This goes along with some other changes I'll briefly talk about. I mean, Robin's going to talk about bass. One of the changes we've seen in bass is they now appear on the deep wrecks off Plymouth to the west on places where we've never seen them. So last year they were on wrecks in 240 foot of water, and typically you'd see them off Lyme in depths up to about 140. But they are now regular, probably more common than pollock are on these wrecks during the autumn and winter months. In fact, they were still around in early January this year. Reasonably limited range of year classes, I'd say. There's not, even though bass populations have recovered to some extent, it would still seem that actually the year classes present reflect what bass have always done. Interesting about the comment, black bream are found in the Tamar, but actually the Couch's bream is now more prevalent, especially juvenile Couch's. And there was a fishery for Couch's bream off Drake's Island, which some of the Rod and Line boys took advantage to a few years ago. But yeah, it's part of this sort of movement we've seen. The other species I'll touch on very briefly is actually John Dory, Zeus faber, one of my favourite creatures. I mean, in 35 odd years, I saw 3, and 2 years ago I saw 42 on a boat. And they do seem to form spawning aggregations on certain places, which will be carefully guarded secrets, and on certain wrecks off Plymouth and Looe. That when they're there, they are very heavily rowed up, both the male and female. So there are species that have increased in both number and distribution. Interestingly, they are still very rare east of Stoke Point. There's still an occasional fish. I was talking to some of the Lyme Bay commercial fishermen. They were talking about seeing 2 in their lifetime, but anywhere from sort of Start Point all the way down to Penzance, they're now a regular occurrence. Next slide, please. Conger eels. There are species that have increased in number, especially juvenile fish, and their range all the way up to the Sussex coast. The Tamar, which used to have a very large population of the small cat shark, now these conger eels seem to replace them, and there's a lot of different year classes, from very, very small eels of sort of a foot long up to a fish of 50 to 60 pound, and the distribution goes up past the Tamar Bridge. Lyme Bay conger eel are now incredibly common. as Mal Thomas from Poole said, the anglers, that's their main catch now, is conger eel. I seem to remember a paper in about 2018 that predicted conger range would increase with climate change, and they certainly, it's not so much the range, they've always been big conger all the way up to Rye. It's the number of small fish. The Tamar seems to have a thriving ecosystem of various life stages of conger eel. It's very possible the larger ones now predate the smaller ones. We've seen, whilst we've seen a decline in a lot of the gadoids, conger eel are certainly doing very well. Interestingly, the very large fish the very large females we used to see on the wrecks seem to be less common. I mean, there was a time where a 70-pound, 30-kilo eel wasn't particularly special. Now there are decreasing numbers of these being seen each year, but an increasing number of young fish. I think it would make a very interesting study of the Tamar because it's completely changed from what it was 15 years ago. But it's a theme that we're actually seeing across a lot of species, which I'll touch on later. This is also noted by divers. Picture is beautiful. That's a tiny little conger eel, and they're very common in the Tamar, which is fascinating. Anyway, next slide, please. Now we're on to Robin and bass.
Hi, everybody. We've been running these juvenile bass surveys down in Cornwall since about the mid-90s, and I must pay tribute to Derek Goodwin, who started these off and sadly passed away before Christmas. During that time, we found a lot of variation in year class strength, particularly up until about 2014. There was a series of very weak classes, and this in combination with overfishing was what led to the current restrictions on bass fishing today. Happily, since 2014, things have been a bit better, although there have been some really bad classes like 2018, which is virtually wiped out, we think, by the beast from the east in March. But happily, the last couple of years have been quite good, particularly last year, which we think might be on a par with 2014, although that's provisional. So last year we did 37 surveys on the Fallon Helford. In May and June we looked for the 1-year-olds from the previous year spawning, and that they were quite good in number, which confirmed our assessment of 2023 as quite a good year. And also the fact because they can die in the winter if you have prolonged periods of very cold weather. So if you have temperatures down to about 6 or 7 degrees water temperature for more than about 4 weeks, it can kill off the juveniles in their first winter. But happily that didn't happen because we have having reasonably mild winters at the moment. Interesting, we found our first O group on the 29th of May last year, which I think was the earliest we've ever seen them, which makes us wonder if the fish are spawning a bit closer inshore. And then going on from there, we saw good numbers of O groups, and the picture there is of a catch we had at Benalec, one of our sites on the Helford, where we saw 120 O groups on that particular survey. And that was a good catch for that site, but the sites do vary. And one of our better sites, the Lamoran on the Fowl, we saw over 1,500 O groups in one survey in September. So you can see our reason for optimism. Yeah, so let's hope that our findings are correct, and that would be interesting to see what this year proves. We're monitoring the weather conditions at the moment at around the time of spawning, and we've got our fingers crossed that we'll see another good year.
Well done. Can we have the next slide, please? There are a couple of slides on comber.
Actually, I'm wondering if did mean to bring in earlier Rob Hurrell on the salmon and trout.
Good idea.
Okay.
So, Rob, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Hello, I'm Robert Hurrell. I'm a fisheries technical officer with the Environment Agency, and it's nice to be able to share some results with you all. Basically, these are some draft statistical results from the Environment Agency Tamar Index River work. The Environment Agency Analysis and Reporting Team operate a fish counter and a fish trapping facility at Gunners Lake Weir. This is at the head of the head of tide in the Tamar estuary. So over the 30-year period of work at Gunners Lake, so that's since 1994, the 2024 Atlantic salmon run was the lowest recorded, with 1,748 fish in our returning stock estimate. The stock estimate in the year before, in 2023, was 2,283 salmon. So the 2024 figure, that's 53% below the current 10-year average results we've had, and 58% below the all-time average. That run of fish in 2024 consisted of approximately half of those fish for 1C winter grilse, and half being 2C winter, possibly 3C winter salmon. So those would be called multi-C winter fish. But there does seem to be a definite pattern of reducing sea survival of the 1C winter age class of fish. So for sea trout, which was the other species that's actively monitored at Gunners Lake Trap. In 2024, there were 7,259 fish recorded, which was actually a valuable improvement on the previous years, on the 2023 result, which was 4,025 sea trout, and that 4,025 number was the lowest we've ever recorded. The 2024 sea trout run was still one of the lowest. I think that was the 5th lowest in the 30-year time series. And that 2024 result was 30% below the 10-year average and 34% below the all-time average. So there does some of the certainly with sea trout, there seems to be more variability in sea survival from year to year, but some of the recent years have definitely seen poor sea survival. I think that's the main essence of it. If that's
Thanks, Rob.
Useful to you, that Doug.
Okay. The comber is a grouper. It's one of the smallest in the grouper family. Groupers can go up to well over 100 kilos. I know a species I used to work on, they caught one off India at 256 pounds. So, but the comber only goes up to about 30 to 40 centimeters maximum. So it is a small one of the group. They were turning up occasionally in Britain over the past, as you can see from the table on the right. Between 2003, probably from 2000 in fact, up until 2020, there were only about 4. Since then, numbers have been steadily increasing, and in 2024, anglers were reporting them everywhere. They were being, the early ones were mainly caught in lobster pots off the North Cornwall coast, but they seem to be all around and fairly dominant. I think Simon says on some reefs they're chasing off other fish. So very numerous there. It's got to the stage where we can no longer keep individual records because there's just people aren't bothering to record them because they're seeing them all the time. However, If I can have the next slide, please. One significant feature was this photo I received from Paul Naylor in November, which is of a juvenile. Now, to the best of my knowledge, in Plymouth Sound, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time a juvenile has been recorded in British or Irish waters. So that does suggest there could now be breeding in this area. So we have there very significant change. Not only have they gone from very occasional to being relatively common, and they appear now to be breeding in the southwest. Okay, next slide, please. Does Matt Slater want to come in on this? Or shall I deal with it?
Yeah, if you like. Yeah, we wanted to flag up that it was a really unusual year for small bream. They were being spotted by snorkelers and divers along the south coast. Virtually every time our sea search volunteers were out, we were getting reports. Jenny Kent did quite a lot of work trying to identify them. It was hard because they were all juveniles around between sort of 5 and 7 centimeters, and silvery and difficult to photograph. In fact, it wasn't until we had one of our volunteers who was out night snorkeling and managed to get a shot of one that was a bit sleepy that we were able to sort of get quite a good picture. Around the same time, we were sharing these images and asking what people thought on Facebook, and a lot of anglers were saying that they were catching small juvenile fish around the south coast of Cornwall. And I think with the help of Doug and a few others, consensus has probably been reached that they are likely to be black spot or red sea bream. You already heard from Simon that they were once quite abundant around the southwest of England, but they all disappeared. So it's really encouraging to see that they may be back, and I hope that there'll be more reports of them in the coming summer, and we get to see them. Whether we see it's just a one-off thing, that'd be interesting. Maybe they've all grown bigger and we won't be spotting them in the shallows, but if we see more small juvenile ones, that might indicate that there's been more than one year class. So yeah, please keep your eyes peeled if you're a snorkeler or a diver, and let us know. Doug, have you got anything to add?
Yes, please. Next slide, please, Bex.
Yeah.
Firstly, my apologies to Keith Raven. This is one of the photos you're talking about, and I forgot to credit it on the slide, so please give my apologies. Yeah, in fact, back in 2023, the anglers were getting a lot of small bream and were claiming them to be black spot, but there was a lot of dispute at the time as to whether they might be axillary. And also some people were claiming boogs. Boog is a small semi-pelagic bream that became relatively common in British waters probably about 2010. There was actually a fishery for them. I don't know if it still exists down in Mount Bay. But they are much more torpedo-shaped and silvery. Though, say, a lot of people were confusing these with boogs. Also, though, up until about 2020, we had 7 records for Britain and Ireland of the axillary sea bream, Bergillus acani. And certainly they are very, very similar. Some of the sightings, and when the anglers have actually caught them and got good photos, some of the ones they've got have been axillary, but they seem to be very much the minority. I spent some time at the university going through video cam footage, and the black spot, Bogarevevo, has as an adult, has a dark blotch at the origin of the lateral line, whereas acani, the axillary, has a black spot in the axilla at the base of the pectoral fin. So as adults, they're fairly distinctive. However, both those features tend to be missing in the juveniles. And there's 3 features I've managed to find which will distinguish them in the juvenile. These are the colour inside the mouth, which is kind of salmon or yellow in an axillary. The dorsal fin has a definite dip in it where the soft rays finish and the spiny rays finish and the soft rays begin. And the anal fin in both of them has 3 large spines, but in the axillary it has about 10 soft rays, and in the black spot it's got 13. So those are features that you need extremely good photos or else a fish in the hand to separate. So it looks as if the vast majority of the ones turning up now are the black spot, but there are increasing numbers of axillary, and also there is confusion with boog, though boog should be fairly easy to separate once you get your eye in. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, Pete Davis recently sent me this wonderful photo of a sorp or SWME, and to the best of my knowledge, it's the 5th ever found in British waters, or British and Channel Islands. I had one a few years ago, but the guy in the market said, "Oh yeah, I had that," and I threw it away. I did actually get one later. I was able to confirm the identification on, but very, very unusual. I understand this one went to the fish market. I don't know what effects it had, because in the Mediterranean, they are known to occasionally produce hallucinogenic effects, though that may depend on what they're eating. The algae or the phytoplankton they've been feeding on may be the cause of that. So it's a very rare one. It's the kind of thing we increasingly seeing. Who knows, it might start catching up with the other breams. Next, please. This actually I mistakenly identified as a sorp originally because it does have yellow stripes on it. And it's only when I circulated, it's got the very small mouth as well, very small mouth in both, and yellow longitudinal stripes. But when I circulated it to some European friends, they said, "What the earth are you talking about? It's a rabbit fish, a siganus." And this one, which was found inside the belly flaps of a gutted haddock. A shipment of haddock was brought into Plymouth to a Plymouth fish merchant from Brixham, and they had been gutted, so the belly flaps were open, and one of these fish had stuck itself into this inside of the body flaps. How it got there, we've no idea. The other name apart from rabbitfish is spinefoot. They are very spiny. If you get stabbed by those spines, it's very painful, possibly slightly venomous. I actually did some work on culture of another species of this family in the Arabian Gulf, so I'm familiar with them. Very laterally flattened, very soft-fleshed, but in Bahrain they are considered one of the best eating fish. Next slide, please. Not only is the dorsal fin got these very sharp spines, but the first spine of the dorsal fin, you can't really see it, you can just about make it out if you look here, is actually pointing forwards. It points forwards in front of the first obvious one. Very sharp spine pointing forward. Makes it this a siganid, which is an Indo-West Pacific family. And this one is actually Siganus rivulatus, the rivulated spinefoot or marbled rabbitfish. And the species has migrated through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. There are actually 2 species of spinefoot of rabbitfish have done this. Siganus have done this, but this is the one that spread most through the eastern Mediterranean. And until this fish turned up, the previous westernmost one in the world was from Marseille area of the south of France. So Where it came from, we don't know, but a most strange one. We have had fish in the past, silver pomfret, which have actually turned up. Two have turned up about 40 years apart from Indian Ocean in British waters. One was off Grimsby, I believe, and one off Brixham. And that was a silver pomfret from the Indian Ocean, and they're thought to have followed shipping. Have got underneath ships and just gone along with them to end up in our waters. So they can get through their own accord, but who can tell? Next slide, please. This one, also from Pete Davis, passed to me, caught by Clive Inch off Salcombe, is a scorpion fish. We get two species of scorpion fish in Britain. One, the black, has been about 4 or 5 records of. This one, the red, occur every 3 to 4 years. And last year there were 2, one from Cornwall and one off Salcombe. So it's a fish, warm water fish, which will probably become commoner, and also excellent eating. They are the basis for bouillabaisse in the Mediterranean. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's where I hand over to Paul Naylor.
Thanks, Doug. Right, blennies and gobies, put together with Lynn Baldock. The warm water or sort of southern blennies, if you like, although of course the black-faced blenny isn't a true blenny, it's a triple fin, but they both seem to be doing pretty well in terms of breeding, being seen in quite a lot of places. So perhaps, you know, partly correlated to climate change, of course. I think the black-faced blenny is a really good example of observer bias, because there were some reports of them not being around. I was seeing a lot in quite a number of places, Dorset, Devon and Cornwall, and it just, I think I've got my eye in now for exactly their specific habitat, which is amongst bryozoans, particularly sort of bryozoan turf under overhangs. They're really difficult to spot, and if you don't see a male sort of flashing his stuff, the yellow, they are incredibly cryptic. So just an example of a difficult animal to know, you know, whether they're increasing or not. In the study of individual tompot blennies in Wembury continues, breeding males doing as expected, guarding eggs for the normal period, just where they aren't affected by either sand engulfing the reefs. As sand moves around due to storms, they lose territories, and to young conger eels. And just going back to conger eels, that's why I've I noticed so many. And thinking back, you know, decades ago, I just never saw small conger eels. And now when you look in sort of shallow reef crevices around Wembury, Plymouth Sound, Torbay, you know, alongside the normal velvet swing crabs, rocklings, squat lobsters and so on, in these crevices on the reefs, you very often see these tiny congers. The one mentioned earlier, that was a relatively big of a small one. I mean, I see them sort of not much fatter than a sort of marker pen, some of the really tiny ones, and I see so many more of them. Anyway, I was just going back to the blennies. Gobies, just a few odd observation of unusual gobies. Stephen's goby in Plymouth Sound, again, doing well. Saw quite a lot of courtship behaviour, never seen before, and sort of territorial behaviour from men. This summer there's one with eggs there, and an unusual goby in that you can actually see into the nest and see the eggs without disturbing them, whereas a lot of the other gobies, you think they've got eggs, but without, and obviously not wanting to disturb, turn up the shell, you can't see them. Possibly the most significant finding on the whole slide is Lynn's observation, that very last bullet point, that she thought that Pneumatoschistus numbers, so that's painted goby, I think sand and common gobies, numbers disappear or appear reduced around Dorset, and she also saw a similar trend in Scotland. So be interesting to see if that continues, and obviously important to get as many people's eyes on them, because there are, you know, those other gobies mentioning above are relatively rare, but the gobies that are very numerous and presumably very important in the ecosystem and the food chain are those Hematoschistus gobies, so important to keep an eye on their numbers. That was all I was going to say, unless anyone had any questions.
Let's kind of move on. Yeah. Okay, Neil has very kindly obviously supplied a section for the report that we're producing, and if I'll run through this very quickly. It's been a pretty good year for records of seahorses. You know, relative to other years, it's certainly been not abnormal. When we had the community of practice meeting, we I think came to the conclusion that, which Neil fully supports, that the spiny seahorses, 21 observations, prefer seagrass and seaweeds for the species that he's listed there. Short-snouted seahorses seem to be more commonly observed, but also seem to have a wider range of preferences. And Neil is keen to kind of point out the kind of database that he and the Seahorse Trust are developing. I think he pointed out, I mean, this was pointed out, that there's this one very notable record of one of those bream who kind of came along and ate 38 short-snouted seahorse fry, which were recorded in the stomach of the bream. But Neil pointed out that, again, predation on seahorse fry, it isn't unknown, and perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by this. Next slide, please, Bex. Doug, do you want to?
Triggerfish is always a difficult one to get any real analysis on, because some people regard it as rare and others as common, and really the numbers depend a lot on the reporting rather than the encounters. Sometimes you find spearfishermen who get quite a few, let you know, and that will push the numbers up. And other times, lots of strandings on the beach and people doing beach combing and shore searching do find a lot. So in 2024, most of the reports were of stranded ones, and these are usually ones coming in over winter. So very variable response in terms of what records we get in, but very difficult to analyze, as we don't know how many go unreported. Okay.
If we move on to the next slide, yeah.
Thanks, Bob. And hi, everyone. Pete Davies here. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Emma Sheehan's research group at the University of Plymouth. I'm sorry I haven't included any photos in this slide. I'll know for next time, but I'll try and paint a picture in your minds about what we've been up to. We have a acoustic telemetry network now across the stretches across the southern coast of the UK, starting in Sussex and stretching all the way to Falmouth, off Dodman Point. I think it's the furthest west receiver we've got. So acoustic telemetry is effectively a means of tagging and tracking marine species, as many of you will know. The Fish Intel project was an Interreg funded project involving ourselves, the University of Plymouth, various partners in the UK, and various partners in Europe, which ran from 2021 to 2023. And the Fish Intel network, as we're now calling it, is what we hope will be a permanent or semi-permanent array of receivers that enable us to look at fish and crustacean and elasmobranch movements. Our two current projects that I'm going to talk about today were fisheries industry science partnerships. They've been running for 2 years and they've just wrapped up. The first one was called Angling for Sustainability, and we were effectively looking at the movements and migrations of black bream and various different elasmobranch species, taupe, starry smoothhound, thornback ray, and undulate ray. On the black bream side of things, we've through this tracking work, we found some really interesting insights into their ecology over the last year, and I'll post some links to papers in the chat. But the main one with bream is, as Simon mentioned, they are a species with quite an interesting life history. The male will excavate a nest in the sediment, usually over smooth rock or chalky bedrock, so they have quite specific habitat requirements for nesting. The males will excavate these nests, and in places where black bream come together to nest during the nesting season, April to June roughly, the seabed can really resemble a moonscape. It's an amazing cratered landscape that the seabed takes on. And so we found through this tracking work, by tracking individual black bream at these nesting sites, that individuals will return year on year to the same nesting sites. For example, in Poole Bay, we were tagging fish as part of this most recent project. We had two nesting sites separated by about 5 kilometers. Tagging fish at these nesting sites during the spawning season. We showed that we were able to track them over multiple seasons, and we were showing that even between two sites that were only separated by about 5 kilometers, the individuals would return to those sites year on year. And they will also migrate a long way. So outside of the spawning season, we've kind of shown that black bream are highly migratory, and a large number of our fish have been picked up on the other side of the channel, including in Channel Islands, as well as in various wind farms in the northern French coastline. And as Simon mentioned, a fair few have also migrated west and been picked up off places like the Eddystone.
Half a block of ice cream in the fridge.
So we have been working quite closely with. Sorry, there's a bit of. Is it? I think Bob, there's some background noise. Sorry. So we've been working quite closely with the local IFCAs on the black bream management, because both of those, both Sussex and Southern IFCA, are currently reviewing their bylaws for black bream management. So we're working quite closely with them, because that's an ongoing review happening at the moment. Other notable findings from the network. The benefit of this type of research is it enables us to look at the movements of species that we're interested in, but we can also inform on the movements of other individuals that have been tagged elsewhere by other people. So just to give you an example, over the last few years, we've been picking up a lot of thwaite shad from places like Belgium and the Netherlands, and they tend to be, we know that thwaite shad in the UK spawn in rivers, in the River Severn and rivers that feed into the Bristol Channel. But we've shown that in the English Channel, the thwaite shad that we encounter in the sea will most likely originate from Belgium and the North Sea, rather than the Bristol Channel population, which it seems are more likely to overwinter in the Celtic Sea. So lots of interesting findings. We've also picked up poor beagle sharks from northern Brittany that have come and been picked up on our receivers. And so yeah, looking forward to updating you all next time. And thanks for having me.
Keith.
Do you want me to say something on this?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Okay. So, after the end of the winter, which was a dreadful winter for continuous gales and very heavy rain, going back in the water and expecting to see the wrasse coming out of hiding in, let's say, April, May time, and the pollock beginning to arrive at the tops of cliffs and such like, they just weren't there in any numbers. Now, that was me in Plymouth Sound making observations. Other people have said that, though, for places like Haybrook Bay and much lower numbers of these near bottom living fish in Kimmeridge and so on. Wrasse in particular, pollock, bass. So I'm floating that to you in terms of my observations, my hypothesis that it might have been due to continuous storms and heavy rain, and asking whether you've got observations and whether you've got a take on that hypothesis.
And I mean, if I add the point that Mal Thomas made again about the just reduced numbers of fish from anglers, it brings us to this point about whether we need to do, go beyond the anecdote and do more systematic recording on some of the dives we do, looking specifically for fish.
Well, I've started doing that, and I've got quite a good response from folks in Natural England who got methods for monitoring fish populations using divers. It's not easy. They dash about a bit, and visibility is sometimes not really up to making observations. But I think if we go to some specific locations which are easily refound, perhaps we can do something better to make our observations more quantitative. And that's what I'm trying to do today when I leave a little bit early, perhaps, from this meeting, is to go to a specific gully in Firestone Bay where the Ballan wrasse usually gather, and where they seem to have little dances to do with breeding, and to see whether that's going on. And doubtless Paul Naylor can do the same in the same place. But yes, we need to be more systematic, but don't think that it's going to be easy. It's not.
Could I just butt in there, actually? I was theme leader on the Pollock Fish project. I attended the stock assessment. One of the interesting things in the Pollock stock assessment was the recruitment was less than was predicted by the models. We don't really know whether that's year zeros, year ones, or year twos, because they're not caught. The minimum landing size is 30 centimetres. So ICES themselves were very interested in any method at all they could get for assessing juvenile pollock populations, to try and see where this sort of shortfall in predicted recruitment is actually happening, because the fishing mortality isn't high enough to produce the small amount of recruits they're seeing. So we definitely need to talk about this, and we need to get some sort of systematic method in place, probably across the UK, that can actually help to assess about juvenile pollock, and very much like to do wrasse as well.
About 20 years ago, when I was regularly down Plymouth Fish Market, several fishing boats there were relying on the pollock as their main fishery. They were putting set nets out for pollock, and that was their big fishery in those days. I was amazed to hear that now that's been restricted.
Yeah,
I think it's going to be
Yeah, we need to press on so we can get to the end of this, and then we're going to have a discussion.
What you're saying, I think, is try to do size as well as just numbers.
Yeah. Okay, Doug. Oh, sorry, Simon, rather. Simon, last two, and then Doug for the turtles.
I mean, how can we tie this together? One of the things we have seen since 2016 across the apex predators, from bluefin tuna to blue sharks to poor beagle to thresher, we've seen a massive increase in them in the southwest. Species, I mean, as you can see from the graph at the bottom there in the bottom left-hand corner, poor beagle almost disappeared from the south coast of the UK for 30 odd years. And suddenly we're seeing lots of year classes, from huge females that must have predated the zero tack in 2010 to large numbers of pups, year zero fish. And we're seeing these year zero fish in places where we just don't see the big females, which is very interesting. I presume they must be there. So certain wrecks are holding these fish. Now, at the same time, as you can see by the graphs on the right, the gadoids, the mesopredators, and this isn't just the three I've mentioned here, this is also ling and haddock, have all declined. Whiting, cod, pollock, the western stocks are all in trouble. It's very interesting to see, and it's rather alarming, but we have seen some enormous changes from a point where these fish were hugely commercially important and important to recreational anglers, to the point where, you know, in 2016 you could see reasonably large numbers of cod around. I think I saw 2 last year. Whiting, which are a staple population, again has collapsed in the Western Channel, and in, you know, even the north coast of Cornwall. And these things are happening in real time. Whilst tuna populations have actually been incredibly high. You know, blue sharks are probably as high as they've been since the 1960s. But interestingly, maybe this has happened before. The Great Gadoid expansion happened in about 1963, I think, something like that, the cold winter of 63. And that actually happened at the same time when the tuna disappeared last time. So the fishery from Norway and in the east of the UK collapsed that year. And we didn't see them for a great number of years. Maybe this is partly a natural cycle. Maybe these are things that have been accelerated by climate change. But one of the things that was very apparent, and talking to CFAS, is the recruitment of whiting, cod and pollock has been exceptionally poor over the last few years. Interestingly, you can predict where pollock are going to be during the spawning season, or the areas of wrecks they're going to inhabit by sea surface temperature. They don't like, in complete reverse to bass, sea surface temperatures to spawn much above 10 degrees. Whereas this year we had 10 degrees in January, we were actually seeing male bass full of milt in January. But the pollock, they will find an area that is actually below 10 degrees, preferably even lower than that. Next slide, please. So, again, things like thresher sharks, a species that I never saw. You know, I've been out there for 40 years. I've seen an awful lot of other sharks. I've even seen 2 mako. I'd never seen a thresher shark till last year. And now they're regular visitors to the southwest. I mean, part of it may be that people are fishing for bluefin tuna and in areas where we just never went during this time of year the threshers were here. But it does seem that they migrate up the channel. And last year they didn't make it to the Isle of Wight and then retreated back. But again, all these species, the gadoids, seem to be decreasing in the Eastern Channel and the Western Channel. And I think it was mentioned during the Celtic cruises. I mean, things like sardines and anchovy have increased dramatically in numbers in the last few years, whilst traditional species, and it seems from the work we've done, that pollock actually prefer things like sprat and herring during the spawning season. Might be a very good reason for that. Maybe the fatty acid profile is very conducive to producing eggs that survive. But for all these species, there is evidence that sea surface temperature plays a major part in recruitment. But we don't know for sure. We don't know why the pollock population, why the recruitment's so poor at the moment, but we need to. And I think by one of the things we did in Pollock Fish, we used recreational charter skipper data to actually produce effort, but also length-based assessments. So we recorded over 16,200 fish in 3 years, covering most of SWME from Weymouth down to Land's End. But you know, there aren't these data available for other species, although I've got really good records of the sharks. But you know, things like cod and whiting, we just don't have these records. And I think if we can find a way, because there's no way CFAS is going to be able to afford to do this stuff, we can find a way to try and assess recruitment, even just measuring lengths. I mean, there are fisheries assessment tools you can use that are purely length-based. So things like this, you know, are really, really important. So it's sort of a plea to, yeah, can we all coordinate and actually get some better understanding of juveniles, and also the massive changes we've seen, because, you know, we were talking about at the ICES meeting for pollock, we were talking in terms of a regime shift. And if we really are seeing this in real time, it'd be really good to know what exactly causes it. So I think that's probably the end of this. So we'll go to the next one.
So yeah, look, there's plenty of things to talk about in the conclusions. Doug, if you'd like to finish us off with a couple of slides on turtles. Doug, you're on mute.
sorry, 2023 was a very unusual year with a lot of hardshell turtles turning up. Most of these were thought to be juveniles and thought to have been cold shocked and therefore carried up onto our shores by the currents, whereas of course the leatherbacks tend to come into British waters to feed on jellyfish, so they actively come up. They can maintain a certain amount of body temperature above the ambient, whereas the hard shells don't. So the normal pattern over the past years, which I'll look at in a second, is that it's mainly loggerheads with some stranded hard shells, but 2023 were more hard shells. It seems to be as if it was changing back in 2024. So we're getting stranded loggerheads, the main hard shell that occurs, some Kemp's Ridleys. Over in Ireland, they had 2 green turtles, which are rather rare in British waters. So it looks at the beginning of the year, there was still the cold shocked individuals coming in, but towards the middle of the year, it was back to the more normal pattern, possibly with some more strandings of hard shells towards the end of the year. So next slide, please. You can see those figures here, the exceptional thing in 2023, where there was 16, and they were all hard shells occurred, whereas normal pattern is more leatherbacks, because a lot of the unidentifieds will be leatherbacks seen at sea, which couldn't get a definite identification on. So we're seen to be reverting to the previous population, and the levels of sightings are back to about normal. So possibly going back to the previous pattern. Thank you.
So Bex, if we could have the final slide. So Bex, if you could switch off the recording now. So thank you, all of you for your attendance today. I hope you found it interesting and useful. We're going to stay open